This is a leadership meeting, top leadership meeting with a very special guest, with Yaakov Katz, the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. Yaakov is an author of Shadow Strike: Inside Israel's Secret Mission to Eliminate Syrian Nuclear Power, and co-author of Weapon Wizards: How Israel Became a High-Tech Military Superpower, and Israel versus Iran: The Shadow War. So he is well published and does a major service as the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. This session for top leadership is a closed session, and it's taking place just 10 weeks prior to Israel's 5th election in 3 years. So our intent is to have the opportunity to hear from Yaakov and then answer questions about Israel's current political situation and key aspects in the upcoming election. For example, we have new parties, like the new party that Benny Gantz has expanded his party. Every day we hear, Eisenkot, we hear Kahana, we other people coming in. We have what had been Yamina has split apart and struggling to be above the minimum. In the latest polls, Labor and their cause are struggling to be above the threshold. There are issues about how the Arab-Israel vote changed the entire paradigm as it did last time. There are questions as to the extent to which Haredi parties would be enticed to join a coalition that's not headed by Netanyahu. We're also very interested to hear about what this might mean, these different coalitions for religious pluralism, for the implementation of the Western Wall Agreement, funding, as Nachman Shai has been trying to do in the diaspora, etc. So, in any event, welcome to those who are here. A few others might be joining. I'm delighted that Emily Levy-Shochat, who's my co-president now of Merkaz Olami, is here. Emily, hello. And Yaakov, we're honored to have you, and we turn to you at this point.
Okay, well, thank you, Rabbi Silverstein, and everyone else. It's great to be. Everyone can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So it's great to be joining you from Yerushalayim, from Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, 2 Shabbats ago, I was actually in a fascinating synagogue in Tarrytown, New York. I was in the States on vacation, and my wife and I went away to the castle on the Hudson. It now has a different name, but anyhow, Erev Shabbat, I looked to see if there's a synagogue nearby, and I found a place that wasn't too far called Temple Beth Avraham, which we ended up going to Shabbat morning, which turns out to have a very interesting story. So we davened in a conservative service, but in a Reform temple, because as one of the older congregants explained to me, so I got Kohen, which was nice, and Hagba, and my wife got Galila. They really put us to work. It was apparently it started as an Orthodox synagogue back in like the late 19th century. In the 50s became a conservative. In the 30s became a conservative synagogue. And then sometime in the 50s, one of the guys told me at a vote that was won, but because of one swing vote, it became a Reform temple, but there's still a conservative holdout there. So anyhow, just an interesting, definitely an interesting experience, which I always we always try to do if we have the opportunities to, because in Israel you don't get that, right? You don't have necessarily the opportunity to experience these different types of and the ways of that things are done, like you have in the U.S. or other places around the world. Excuse me. So I think it's just always an interesting experience for anyone who, especially coming from here. But to our topic of elections. So beyond just the general depressing news, which is that Israel is going to a new election, and we don't really know exactly why and what will change when all the candidates are the same and all the voters are the same. So why should we expect there to be a different result? There's no big change, right? Last night's groundbreaking news was supposed the entry or decision of the former chief of staff, Gadi Eisenkot, to enter into politics and to join the party of Benny Gantz, who was his predecessor on the 14th floor of the Kiryat military headquarters in Tel Aviv when he served as chief of staff. But it got me thinking of how in the span of less than 3 years, Benny Gantz has gone through 6 different iterations of his party, right? He started as Chosen L'Israel, Israel Resilience. And if you think back to the colors of that slogan, it was green. It was kind of playing up his army and military experience. Then it became Chosen L'Israel and Telem. Telem was the party of the other chief of staff, Bogi Moshe Ya'alon. Then Chosen L'Israel Telem became Kahol Lavan, blue and white, and changed its colors in accordance with the new name when Yair Lapid merged with them. Then when Gantz decided to join with Bibi, that was the 4th iteration. It stayed Kahol Lavan, but without the Yair Lapid or Bogi Ya'alon. Then it became Kahol Lavan with New Hope, with Tikva Chadasha, with Gidon Sar's party. That was number 5. And now we're at number 6, where it's no longer Kahol Lavan, Tikva Chadasha. Now it's called Machaneh HaMamlachti, which doesn't really translate well into English because there's no good word for Mamlachti in English. Statesmanship, it just doesn't roll off the tongue. The same way there's no good word for, in the opposite way, we always joke how there's no word in Hebrew for accountability in the language, and that might be a reason why there is no accountability in this country for a lot of different things, but that's a separate conversation. But they're calling themselves the National Unity Party, which I'm not exactly sure, in English at least, how they get to national unity. Because if you think about it for a moment, there used to be a party, some of you might recall, called the National Union Party, which was known as Yichud Leumi, which was a party that was led by Benny Lau and not Benny Lau, I'm sorry, Benny Lau, Benny Elon, a former very right-wing member of Knesset. They were supportive of the transfer of Palestinians out of the West Bank, extremely right-wing. So it kind of actually brings up reminisce of that party. To make a long story short, you have to ask yourself, though, if a party keeps on changing its name and its identity 6 times in the span of 3 years, what do they actually stand for? And I think that that's what everyone is kind of searching for in these elections, right? And I think that that's just the symptom of a larger problem here in Israel today, which is that we don't have a debate on any of the issues. We don't have a real conversation about policy that should matter for us, whether it is the issue of the economy right now, where everyone around the world is definitely feeling this. And I'm sure people here from the US, especially with the high inflation rate, and I think any minute now, the Treasury and the Bank of Israel will be announcing what the consumer price index is, what's called the Madad in Hebrew. We'll see where it's going, if it's going up in a big way this month or not. But everybody is suffering from the higher prices and inflation, cost of living. But that's not a conversation that we're having, right? We're just days after another round of violence in the Gaza Strip, which could be an opportunity for people to say, okay, we should have a conversation about what do we want with the Palestinians, and what is the future of Israel when it comes to its relationship with the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip or the Palestinians in the West Bank. But also there's a void of any conversation on that policy. And of course, and I know that this is what's close to all of your heart, but on matters of religion and state, forget about it. It's something that no one will even go near because it's toxic. It's a hot potato, right? The fact is that try to ask Benny Gantz or Gadi Eisenkot or Gidon Sar any question about the Kotel proposal what's known as Mitveh HaKotel, the proposed solution from back in the day, or anything else that has to do with religious equality in this country. And they're not going to want to say anything that could potentially rock the boat and cause them damage that would lead the ultra-Orthodox parties, the Haredim, to not want to sit with them in a future coalition, right? So they don't want to do that. Of course, Netanyahu will never do anything like that because he needs and relies on that religious bloc to stick with him to be able to prevent the other side from being able to form a coalition. So in basically, when you look at the end of the day, there's just no great expectation on any front, right? And still we're stuck debating and discussing issues like, do we want Bibi or do we not want Bibi, right? And should we sit with will we sit with Netanyahu or will we not sit with Netanyahu? Take Ayelet Shaked as an example. She's merged the current interior minister, the former minister of the Yamina party, basically the number 2 to Naftali Bennett, merged with Yoaz Hendel, who's like a moderate, I would say, so-called right-winger, is actually mamlachti to an extent. He can actually carry that title. But they're trying to run. They're barely crossing the threshold. All polls show that they're about 3.5% of the vote. You need to be able to cross the threshold in Israel. You need to get 3.25% of the entire vote. And that's how you get in. But they're barely there. So they're within the realm of the statistical error. But they're not saying anything, right? So will they sit with Bibi? Will they not sit with Bibi? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. And again, that's where we are. And to me, it's slightly depressing because I feel that we're missing out on an opportunity, right? Unfortunately, elections, and I was thinking about this the other day, they're supposed to be an opportunity for change. They're supposed to be an opportunity for hope. They're supposed to be an opportunity for people, of course, in the democratic process to be able to express their opinions, be able to try to initiate some sort of change that can bring about to their country with a look of optimism toward the future. But we don't have that here, right? If you look at all of the campaigns, everyone is running on something that they won't do, or how they won't be like the other guy, or how they'll undo what that person did, and how they won't give in to the Arabs, and they won't surrender to the Haredim, and they won't. So it's all about what we won't do, but no one talks about what they will do, right? If you think about, to an extent almost, the last election or the last campaign, and I remember it because I was in Chicago at the time, and I had the opportunity to cover it for the Jerusalem Post, was 2008 during the presidential election in the United States, when we all remember Barack Obama's famous campaign slogan was, "Yes, we can," right? And since then, I feel like definitely in this country, it's all about "No, we won't," right? Or "No, I won't do that," or "No, I won't do this. I won't sit with Ram. I won't sell out the country to Mansour Abbas," and all of these other things. But it's less talking about what we're going to do. And that's chaval. That's a pity. It's a huge missed opportunity, I think, for this country and for the people. When we look at, though, what the potential results could be, and by the way, I don't expect that necessarily to change, right? I don't think there's going to be any big movement in this campaign and in the next couple of months. I don't think, by the way, that we'll see any big campaigning. Right, August is coming towards. We're winding down. We're halfway through, but people are all on vacation. Half this country is leaving the country, as a matter of fact, in the next few days, in the next couple of weeks. Everyone's going to Turkey and Greece and Cyprus and other places. So there's no big campaigning going on now. Once September rolls along, so you'll start to see something in September. But then the 25th, as you all know, is Rosh Hashanah, and then we go into the Chagim, so that everything will kind of get suspended until after Sukkot, which is like the 17th or 18th of October. And then things will pick up for the last 2 weeks of October, running into the 1st of November when we go to vote. Gadi Eisenkot might bring some new votes to Kahol Lavan, to blue and white, but that will just be because of the momentum right now. Nothing significant in the way that's going to change the blocks that we're currently seeing. It's going to be votes that would move probably within the block. So if you're in the center left block, maybe you'll move now from Yesh Atid to Benny Gantz temporarily, or you'll go within from Labor to one or two of the others. But on the right also, we don't expect anything big. What they're all trying to do, though, and this is important to point out, is they are trying to play with two or three of what they call the Yamin Rach, right? The moderate, soft right wing, that maybe these are people who can move from one block to the next, and that could change the outcome of these elections, right? The way that could potentially happen is one of two ways, essentially. The first is that Netanyahu gets 61. Right now, every day, every poll shows a different result, Tombo. Some days he crosses, some days he doesn't. But it shows how fragile and delicate the situation is from his perspective. The reason that he might get it is if, for example, Ayelet Shaked were to run till the end and she would actually cross the threshold and get 4 seats, that would give him the 61. If she fails to cross the threshold, he wouldn't. Now, if you all recall, in the first of these 5 rounds of elections, so the one that took place in April of 2019, Naftali Bennett then did not cross the threshold as the head of the new right party, as they called it at the time, Yamina Chadash. And he was only short like 1,200 or 1,300 votes. Bibi ate up and tried to kind of suck away votes from Bennett. Had he not done that, Bennett would have crossed the threshold and Bibi would have had a coalition. Right. So Bibi will have to think very carefully what type of campaign will he run against Ayelet Shaked if Shaked actually decides to run till the end, because he might be self-defeating. If he goes too hard against her, then it might be self-defeating and it might bring down his opportunity to have a coalition. But that's one option. Bibi gets the 61. Second option is that on the other side, he does not get 61, but no one on the other side has 61 either. Yair Lapid today does not have 61. He's climbing in the polls. He's getting to 25, 26 seats, which is nice to see. But being prime minister is obviously paying off for him. But it's not going to be enough to be able to form a coalition because he doesn't have a coalition without relying on 2 Arab parties, Ram and the joint list. And that's something that's just won't be feasible. That the joint list might be able to give support, but sitting in a coalition, no. And I don't see a scenario of where Gideon Sa'ar would give a hand to that or other people would. They would prefer to go to another election. So who's the most likely person to actually be prime minister if it's not going to be Netanyahu? I would argue it's actually Benny Gantz. And the reason this is what Benny Gantz is trying essentially to do, is to position himself as the person who can actually bring the Haredim. So the Haredim have not ruled him out like they did, for example, to Yair Lapid. And Gantz could come to Bibi and say, listen, I will be prime minister in the first rotation, and I'll sit for 2 years. You, in the meantime, deal with your trial. Netanyahu won't be able to be a minister. And the Haredim would accept that. The Haredim don't want another election. They want to be back in the coalition. They're hungry for budgets and for power once again, and for the different ministries that they could control once again. And then Gantz would be able to be prime minister first. Bibi's trial would continue. Maybe it would end at some point. Maybe he'd be acquitted. Maybe he'd convicted. Maybe he'd get a slap on his wrist. He'd be able to come back. He wouldn't be able to come back. Whatever the scenario might be. But then we could find ourselves with what could potentially be a stable coalition. Is that likely? I don't know. But the alternative is that we go to another election. That's what might be Yair Lapid's best case scenario, is that we actually go to another election and then he again continues on as prime minister, as we saw, by the way, Netanyahu do through 4 rounds of elections. So it's not unheard of, but what we need to remember is that this is definitely not something that's good for the country. I think that in the end, and I don't want to go on for too long to be able to open up for questions, but to talk about Lapid just for a moment, Lapid, if you notice, is being very careful and also very quiet, right? The reason is that Lapid has this theory that so far has played well for him, according to which if you're generous in politics, it pays off in the long run. That was his first gamble and it worked well, right? When he allowed Bennett to go first in the rotation between them when they founded and established what's known as the Memshelet Shinui, the Change Government or the Change Coalition back in June of 2021, people were surprised. Why would Yair Lapid, who has more seats, allow Naftali Bennett, who had much less, to go first? But it was about him saying it's not about the job, it's about the country. I put the country first, and that's something that you don't really see on the Israeli political landscape. So that was something that I think, to an extent, fascinated the average Israeli voter, and that brought him some popularity and more votes. But now also as prime minister, what he's just trying to do is to debunk the widespread myth or theory or what Likud has tried to kind of push all these years, is that if he becomes prime minister, it would be a disaster for the state of Israel. And so far it hasn't been. The Gaza operation was probably, as someone who's covered a lot of these military operations for pretty much the most part of the last 20 years, and written books about these things, it was probably one of the most surgical, very careful, and I would say successful operations that Israel has had. Definitely most successful since the 2008-2009 Operation Cast Lead, which brought on us the Goldstone Report and other problems. But in terms of the success in hitting your targets and knocking them out and ending when you wanted to and not being dragged on and coming up with a clear exit strategy from day one, it worked. And it also showed the average Israeli that, Lapid, not someone who's going to burn the country down, not someone who's going to lead us to disaster, knows how to go after our enemies and take the initiative. So that has played well, and we've seen that's why he's been getting this boost and quite a significant bump in the last week since the operation ended. But I do want to get back to the challenges that I think we continue to face, which is, and maybe with this I'll end. I often feel that to an extent, like a lot of these stories that we write, I was talking with one of my reporters, Khaled Abu Tuama, you might know his name, our longtime Palestinian affairs reporter. And Khaled said to me, Yaakov, I feel like every day we're reinventing the wheel to an extent. It's just like we're rewriting the same story, but we just have to change something. And I said, for years, I felt that we could take the same story from 5 years ago about Israel and Gaza or Israel and Hezbollah, change the names, and it's the same story. It's like one of these bad reruns. I remember growing up as a kid in Chicago, if I'd be sick at home from school, watching, bad reruns of The Love Boat or MASH or whatever was on TV, but they're constantly the same TV show. And to an extent, it's a feeling that I have, which doesn't make me overly excited every day, unfortunately, although I love what I do, but we're kind of not we're not inventing what we should be. We're not coming up with the big ideas about what Israel has the potential to be. Instead, we're playing personal and identity politics. We're not talking policy. And that is that's a huge missed opportunity. I think that Israel, as we come upon our 75th anniversary of Atzmaut, of independence, we have to recognize a couple of simple facts. The first is that we've been around for 75 years, which is a huge accomplishment, right? Which a lot of people probably thought would not have been possible. Here it is. Two is that we're extremely powerful and strong, right? Militarily, beyond your wildest imagination is the power that Israel has and the ability to project not just within this region, but around the world. Three is economically. I mean, 2 months ago, I had the opportunity to fly out to the Leviathan, to the Leviathan gas rig, which is 10 kilometers off the coast of Haifa, operated by Chevron, and to visit there. We wrote a big story about it, but I wanted to learn more about this changing energy market here. And think about this for a moment, right? Tiny little Israel, without any resources, when it was established back years ago, which, by the way, we have to say, Baruch HaShem, we'd be no different than our Emirati friends and our Saudi friends. Instead, because we didn't have the resource, we had to rely on the one resource we had, which was the Jewish brain, and to become innovative and creative and become the so-called startup nation. But now think about how the fact that we are supplying, as we speak, gas to Egypt and Jordan. and how the president of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, came to Jerusalem a couple weeks ago and didn't say a word about the Palestinians, which is itself shocking, but came to talk about how we're going to get gas to Europe. And by the way, we're going to supply it we're going to send it to Egypt, where it will be converted into LNG, to liquid, put on boats, and then sent off to Europe, which will be converted back into gas and help heat up Europe in the winter to come. I mean, this is Israel. It's mind-blowing, right? So we have this military power, we have this economic power, we have this energy independence. And what are we going to do with it? And we're coming up on our 75th anniversary. So what are we going to do with it? And if you ask me, it's time to grow up to an extent, right? This is the opportunity that we have to make some of these big decisions. Unfortunately, I feel to an extent that some of our politicians don't want to have to make those big decisions, and they want to try to avoid them as much as is possible. And therefore they play a different type of politics because that's easier. It's much more difficult to have to make tough decisions that won't be always as popular as they should be. And that includes, by the way, the religion and state component. These are issues that, to me, should be some of the most important for our country. The fact that, I mean, I have workers here, not a few, who have gotten married in the last few years, who have decided to get married outside of Israel, have decided to get married, of course, not through the Rabbanut. And they're not conservative or reform. They're just a classic Israeli, Chiloni, secular Israeli who just doesn't want to have anything to do with religion in this country, because of how politicized it's become. So I look at this from a perspective of, don't we want people to have a greater Jewish identity? When we look at our schools, we look at our education system, don't we want them to feel proud of being Jewish and to have a participation? But instead, we've politicized this entire process. And it's complicated for people. No one wants to touch it. And I think that this is another one of those unfortunate missed opportunities that we have. But coming up on November 1st, maybe that all will change, and we will see. But with that, I'm happy to end and take any of your questions.
Yaakov, on behalf of all of us, we thank you for that wonderful set of introductory remarks. You have our vote as somebody who's willing to tackle hard issues. Which
thank you, Rabbi, but no, not going to happen. Yeah.
Okay, Rabbi Steve Wernick has a question.
Hi, Yaakov. It's nice to see you again. Thanks for being here. I'm curious on the comment about the no, we won't do that, and the politics of status quo. To what extent does that have to do with a lack of courage of the politicians versus the mood of the electorate? Who's wagging the tail here? Is it the electorate that's wagging the tail of the politicians, or the politicians wagging the tail of the electorate? And what's the role that the media plays in that?
Well, Rabbi Wernick, it's great to see you as well. We won't do that. This was, remind me, I said that about the religion and state issue, or just in general?
I think in general, that the politicians, you were referring to Obama's campaign, yes, we can.
Right, yeah,
and that Israeli politics seems to be, no, I won't do that. Right.
So I think it's a combination, right? What I always think about, to an extent, on this topic is let's think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? So I mean, we have a problem, right? We have millions of Palestinians who live right near us, and we prefer to walk around with blinders on our eyes and to pretend like they're not there. But they are there, and every once in a while there's an issue and it comes up, and so we hit them on the head, or they do something to us, and then we kind of forget about it until the next time that it happens. But no one wants to deal with the bigger issue of what about these millions of people who live there, whether it's in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, and how can we try to come up with some sort of idea? And maybe not even a long-term solution, but some sort of interim solution or something, right, that we can do. So everyone will always tell you about the Palestinians. Forget about them. What about what do we want as a people, as a country? What's the policy? What's our objective? Where do we want to go? A one state, a two state, a three state? Let's decide something and move towards there. Now, I think of Rabin Square to an extent, Kikar Rabin, and I say to myself, okay, if the settlers and the settlement camp and the right-wing camp wanted to hold a rally calling for the machazim, the illegal outposts, to be legalized, and they're going to hold it at Rabin Square, they would fill it up because people would come. On the other hand, if the left-wing side of the map wanted to hold a rally to talk about the need for a two-state solution, people wouldn't come. So the fact that because people wouldn't come, show me a politician that's going to say, I think this is what we should do, when no one's asking them to do it. No one's urging them. With all due respect to leaders today, and definitely our political leaders, but they're not real leaders, because leaders are supposed to take you from one place to another because it's what's right for you, even if it might not be popular, or even if there's going to be obstacles and challenges along the way. I mean, Benny Gantz floored me, I remember about a year ago, when he gave a speech and spoke about Pitaron Shtei HaYishuyot, the two-entity solution. Are you kidding me? You can't even say Shtei HaMedinot, right? You have to call it now an entity, right? But this is, it's all being done because it's toxic. He'll pay a price. He'll be penalized for talking about anything that people will be able to say he's a Smolani, he's a left-winger. So I think it runs both ways, unfortunately, right? I think that most Israelis at the end of the day would agree to the fact that there should be a separation from the Palestinians, but you need someone who's going to take them there. And there's constantly excuses of why no one should do anything, and that's just easier. Well, they still pay pay for slay policy, right? They're still paying prisoners. I mean, you can come up with 1,000,001 excuses why not to do something, as opposed to a reason why you should do something. And it's just more, I think it's easier. So that's what has me not overly optimistic when it comes to the tough, big issues.
Thank you, Yaakov. Folks, if you have a question, please put the reactions, put hand up. I'll ask a question while we're waiting for hands to go up. So Yaakov, listening to your analysis as to what the outcome might be from a religion and state point of view, or religious pluralism for us point of view, clearly Netanyahu, his next prime minister, will do nothing to help us. That's pretty clear. I think those of us who have had meetings with Benny Gantz, the likelihood of Benny Gantz, I mean, if something happened that helped us, he wouldn't oppose it, but he's not going to take any initiative whatsoever. He wants the Haredim to say amen to him. Matan Kahana has made it very clear that he's not interested in the issues that go beyond the modern Orthodox, which are issues he's willing to take a stand on. So if we're looking in terms of self-interest, for us, it seems like the continuation of a Lapid government would be the best. Is that a correct analysis?
It probably is, but I also wouldn't have such high expectations from Lapid, right? Lapid, by the way, when he took office, the first editorial that we wrote, I think ran in the paper, he took office on Friday. I think Sunday's editorial was implement the Kotel compromise now, right? You have the opportunity. You could pass it in the cabinet. You don't need the Knesset for it. You just need it to, just like in January of 2016, when it passed in Bibi's government, and then when he turned it over in June of 2017, 18 months later, right? You don't need you don't need legislation. You don't need chakika. It's a cabinet government decision. You could do it. So why didn't he do it? He's promised all along that he would do it. I remember sitting on a panel once with one of his members of his party. I think she's no longer with the party. I forget her name at the moment. And I said, this was years ago, and I said, Lapid won't do it either. This is back when Bibi was still prime minister. She said, no, you'll see that Lapid, this is one of the first things that'll do. So, I mean, it just proved to me what I thought already. He's not going to do it because he also wants to hold out for the possibility that the Haredim will also come in with him. I argue that, no, actually do it now, get it over with, end it, and you're done. And then it just doesn't become an issue anymore. But even now in this interim period, when he has the full authority and capability to do it, he's not doing it. So I wouldn't expect anything to change. I think you'll get, the reception that you've received until now, which has always been, I hope, to be warm, definitely from Gantz and definitely from Lapid. I know Bibi, of course, always likes to talk about the importance of the Israeli diaspora relationship. But on religion and state, there are not going to be any big moves. Look at, by the way, you mentioned Matan Kahana, right? He's an interesting character. Matan Kahana, for opening up kashrut in this country, by the way, opening it up just to more Orthodox movements and organizations, Zohar and others, the Haredim have vetoed him, right? What did he do? Nothing. I mean, this wasn't some huge revolution that he did. All he did was say it's not just the Rabbanut. Could be Rav Sherlo or some other Rabbanut ordained rabbi, right? So I mean, even with that, they've decided to kind of write him off. I wouldn't expect anything of big steps in that direction.
Okay, I'm not happy, but I'm not in disagreement. So thank you for that analysis. Any hands of people who have got Saray? Ray Crane?
Okay, I actually have two questions. One is the role of the diaspora. So we in the diaspora are never very quiet about our opinions. And we have very strong opinions about Israel, and it's a very divided community. So the question is, does it matter what we think? That, it seems that the discussion about Israel really divides American Jews and in a lot of ways pushes people away from it as we have our own issues here. And we're not drawing people closer. So I'm curious as to, once upon a time with the diaspora thought mattered and had an impact. You go back to the 70s, the 80s, does it matter now? And my second question to you on a different subject is, okay, this is election number 5. I would imagine Israelis are very tired of voting and they're not seeing anything that's really substantial. And Israel's divided. What's the possibility of this government lasting?
Well, maybe I'll start. It's easier, I think, to answer the second question. I think most likely scenarios we go to a 6th election, right? It's very difficult to see how someone forms the stable government. If Bibi gets 61, possible, right? And but it would still, even if it's 61, it would be a government that, like we saw in this past government, that every there's a saying in Hebrew, I think, Kol mamzer hu melech, right? Every person is a king, but I mean that's the reality. So everyone can extort and can threaten, and you're constantly conceding and surrendering and being extorted, and eventually it'll just, the floor will give out beneath your feet. So it might last for a year or two, but you'll constantly have these political battles, and it won't be easy to get things done. So I think it's very possible that we are actually, this is the 5th election, so we can go to a 6th election, right? And we're stuck. We're stuck as long as Netanyahu's there, and that's something that I think we have to recognize. And I'm not getting into whether he is guilty or innocent, but I've made my opinions are no secret. I think he needed to step down the moment he was indicted, because you can't have a prime minister who's on trial. It's just impossible. It's terrible for the social fabric of a country and for the democratic character and soul of a country. Because what ends up happening is, again, forgetting about whether he's guilty or innocent, or you're allowed to get cigars and champagne or not allowed to get cigars and champagne. The moment that you are on trial, every decision that you make as a leader will be suspect, because we, the people, will wonder, are you doing this because it's good for you or because it's good for us? Is it good for your trial or is it good for the people? And that's just not sustainable, and that erodes the democratic fabric of a country. And that's what we've seen. That is what has happened in this country over the last 3 years since we started to go to elections. And the moment that he were to step aside is the moment that Likud would be able to become right away, right? You'd have a different, you could have a normal government, Likud, Yesh Atid, some of the other parties, but you could have 2 big parties, they come together, and we have a stable government that can deal with the big issues that we're facing. To your first question, I mean, the sad answer is no, right? And you know, it pains me because I think it should be an issue, but ultimately it's not, right? Your average Israeli does not wake up in the morning and say to herself or himself, what is, you know, what is the state of my people, or what is the state of the Israeli diaspora relationship today? It's not something that bothers people in particular. It's not something that is on their minds. It's not something that political parties talk about. It's not something that newspapers and radio stations and TV shows talk about. I think we're the only paper right now in the country that has a full-time diaspora affairs reporter in the form of Tzvika Klein, and it makes sense that we would, because we're the Jerusalem Post, right? But Yediot Achronot or Ma'ariv, or, well, Haaretz has people who do it also in their English version, but it's not something that interests anyone, right? So the only time it would come up is if suddenly, for example, you know, you all were to say, we're stopping our support for the state of Israel, or, you know, we're Jewish organizations were to say, we're cutting off, federations would say, we're cutting off funding to the state of Israel. Things like dramatic steps like that. Not that I'm encouraging anything like that, God forbid, but big steps like that would make noise and would make people pay attention. It would grab people's attention, and it would be in the headlines for a day or two. But it would be quickly, don't, you know, we shouldn't live in an illusion, because very quickly it would be written off by politicians and pundits as those left-wing progressive liberal American Jews who have fallen into the trap of the squad and the progressive flank of the Democratic Party, and that's why they're doing what they're doing. When it might not even be, it's not true, but it doesn't make a difference. So I'm not sure that there's necessarily a real way to change that in a huge, in one big kind of step, right? Or one way that you can immediately make a huge difference. My recommendation has always been to think about how some of the settlers have built illegal outposts in the West Bank, right? If you think of the way they've done things, and you know, to some extent, this is how the streams, as they're called, the Zramim in Hebrew, right, conservative reform, have made progress in Israel. Is, you know, how does it work? They locate a hilltop somewhere in the West Bank. They put a water tank, right? Then they make a butka, like one of these little booths, and they bring some sheep. Then they bring a caravan. Next thing you know, there's an electrical cable, and then a water pipe and sewage. And next thing you know, there's 5, 6, 10 caravans. So you have to start with small steps on the ground that change reality, and that's where that's how change comes. I've always believed, right? It's very difficult to do things top down here when it comes to religion and state. It has to come from more, I think, from the bottom up. And that would be the way, I think, that in Israel, to create some lasting change for some of these issues that are important to all of you and to myself as well.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, if people could indicate with your reactions button. Any hands? Okay.
I see Rabbi Blumenthal.
Yes, Jacob, you want to ask a question?
Sure. So Yaakov, I appreciate, and I very much agree with your analysis. So it seems like we also need to take a look within our own space about our own strategy, because that top-down approach is focusing on the Kotel, for example. We've tried it, and I feel like it's not really moving us forward. So what do you think are the spaces within the Israeli electorate that, if we started to do that sort of ground up work, we might want to focus on? Like, what do you think is on the, what are the, because I don't think the Kotel for the average Israeli living outside of Yerushalayim is like the top of mind. And in fact, in some cases, they just see it as like, they're stirring it up again. What are the things that, especially not just among Chilonim, but across like the majority space within the electorate, might be areas that we want to be talking about, or even doing engagement on with our leadership and rabbis?
Well, I'm laughing because I feel like I'm to some extent crossing a line here for a moment as moving from a journalist to like a consultant. But
well, you can do it as an observer. What do you
right? No,
think?
no.
You know,
So yeah,
you
but
can
no,
certainly tell us what you think people care about. You don't have to give us our strategy.
I'm not avoiding the question. I'm embracing it. I've often joked, well, not joked, but I've said that if someone were to give me a couple $1 million, I know the campaign that I would run in this country to change religion and state, right? And I don't know if it would work. I've never done research on it. Is I would make huge billboards across the country that show a Sephardi, good-looking Mizrahi man, right, 20-something-year-old in uniform, let's say, standing next to a beautiful blonde-haired, blue-eyed soldier, also in uniform, and make it clear somehow that she's of Russian or former Soviet Union descent, and he's clearly Sephardi-looking, so he's, clearly Jewish according to halacha. And say, Bibi, lama nachnu lo yocholim litchaten, or something like that, right? Bibi, why can't we get married? I think that is a huge issue, huge, that people tend to ignore, right? The fact that there are hundreds of thousands of people in this country that cannot get married, I mean, it's difficult to wrap your head around it, but to think that we're a democracy that doesn't allow a significant percentage of its own people the basic right to get married in their country is insanity, right? It makes no sense to me. So, I mean, you have the numbers, there's more conservative, more liberal, but numbers talk about anywhere from 250,000 people to 400,000 people who cannot get married in the state of Israel. These are people who served in the army. These are people who pay taxes. These are people who are law-abiding citizens. Marriage is a basic right, I think. Not that it's written in any constitution, but it is a basic right. And these people can't get married here, so they have to go overseas, or they don't get married for that matter. I've always felt that this is something that more people need to turn into a bigger campaign, and that this touches on so many people. And there's so many stories that I just hear from just of friends of, a guy I know from the army, or someone I know here at work, or people who fall in love with someone who turns out is not halachically Jewish, and then what do? Right? So they fly to Cyprus, or they have a ceremony here, but it's not really a ceremony, but the parents want a ceremony. I mean, so now talk about conversion. Things become very complicated. So I've always felt that's one of these issues it's not the Kotel. Because the Kotel sounds, at the Kotel, what they'll always do is they'll show pictures of women with tefillin and carrying a Torah, and that just turns off so many of even secular, but traditional secular Jews. Right? You think about definitely the Mizrahim in Israel; they're more traditional than Ashkenazim, and it turns people off, whether it's right or wrong. It's reality, and it's an easy. The Haredim have run a very successful campaign in kind of demonizing what that is, right? Here, you can't do the same. You can't just write this off and say, well, they also give bar mitzvahs to dogs, as they've tried to do, right, with the Reform Jews as an example. Here, you can't do that, right? There's an easy story to tell. And people are not talking about this enough, in my view, at least. And I think here there's something that can actually affect change, because it's crazy that this is the reality. But again, no one wants to talk about it until it somehow will actually, one day it will blow up in some way. So I feel like there is some sort of fertile ground to do something.
Thank you. We will take one last question. Jacob, now I see why I didn't see your hand up, because you have a yellow background. Okay, Mirko, please, just unmute yourself.
Hello. Thank you, Jacob. It's really been interesting so far. I'm from Brazil, and I find that the Latin American youth have very little interest in the Israeli political situation, other than maybe the youngsters that go to Shnat. So before I think the youth can be of any influence to the process in Israel, I think they have to be motivated to read about it and get involved. Do you have any, maybe one or two ideas how we should try and help these young people to be more interested in the Israeli politics?
We don't know how, Marco, we don't know how to get Israelis more interested in Israeli politics. My oldest daughter, Atara, is actually she's drafting into the IDF in just about 3 weeks. And she'll be voting for the first time in this upcoming election. And I've started talking to her about it, and she really, she doesn't know enough about the parties, and she hears it. It's not exciting for people. And I think that one of the problems that we have in general is that, the people of the book, which we are to an extent, we've lost the ability to tell a story today. Right. I feel that to an extent might be at the core of one of our problem is we need a narrative. Right. So I forgot who it was. Saray, I think, spoke about the diaspora support of Israel back in the 70s or maybe the 80s or 60s. But there was definitely, I know my parents' generation, definitely my grandparents' generation, Holocaust survivors, of course, from Skokie, who to them Israel was, there was no question that you support Israel, right? And my parents as well, and even my generation to an extent, right? But because we had that narrative of a country that's under attack and a country that's threatened and a country that needs our support, but we're not that anymore, right? We are a powerful country, and which I kind of spoke about before, and therefore we have to tell a new story. And what is that story that we're telling? And different people try different things. There was that whole movement a couple of years ago, talk about Tikkun Olam and Startup Nation and all that stuff, and that's all nice, but it didn't catch on really, right? It didn't change the Israeli story. It gave people outside a new tool to try to connect people to Israel, but it didn't change the way Israel was at its core. And that's for Israel to want to create a new narrative of the type of country that it wants to be. And I don't know that we're there yet, and we're able. I hope that we can, and I think we do need to come up with a new story to tell of why we're here. What is it that we're doing in this land? I often think about what's the problem that and Rabbi Warnick kind of asked me about the role of media, and I think I might have skipped over answering that before. But one of the things that I'm very concerned about today is just the whole relationship between readers and the media today, or the whole way that we look at and we consume media, we consume the news. One quick story I could tell you is, on Yom Yerushalayim, so on Jerusalem Day, there's the annual parade down Rehov Jaffa Road, which is just outside my office here, all the way down to Damascus Gate. And I hadn't been there in a couple of years, and I decided to walk down on Yom Yerushalayim. So I went down to Damascus Gate and sat there and went inside and watched as the Kahanas came in with their stickers, Kahana Tzedak, Kahana was right, and I watched as the people walked through and yelled Mavet l'Aravim, death to Arabs, and other racist slogans. But I sent another reporter from the office to go out and interview people who were walking in the parade. The next day, top-ranking member, vice president of a prominent Jewish organization in the United States, I won't name the person, tweeted out my colleague's article, which had a headline of something like, "This is a parade of love, it's not about hate," something like that. And he interviewed some people who were marching and said, a screenshot and said, "The Jerusalem Post used to be a serious newspaper. It's no longer a serious newspaper." I said, okay. 5 minutes later, he tweets out the one article I wrote, which is, the headline was something like, "Israel has a racism problem and needs to deal with it." And it was very, very critical and highlighting this racism that I witnessed there. And said, "You should all read Yaakov Katz's article." So I couldn't hold back anymore. So I tweeted back at this guy and I said, "You got to decide which is it. Are we a serious newspaper that should be read, or are we not a serious newspaper?" So he, to his credit, he wrote to me privately. He deleted the first tweet. But to me, it's a symptom of something that's a bigger problem that I encounter all the time, which is the ability to open our ears to what someone else has to say, and to another opinion, and to a different narrative, and to a story that doesn't fit into what we already believe. We're closing off our minds to something that doesn't fit into the ideology or the story that we're already telling ourselves. So if we're right, we can only listen right. And if we're left wing, we can only listen left. And by the way, it's a problem. This is going to destroy us all, I think. At the face this, or community and organizational leaders, you face this all the time with the balance that you all have to somehow delicately live with. Of what can you say and what can you do and what stand can you take and who will you upset today or who will you upset tomorrow. I think, by the way, I've said this before, that newspaper editor is like being a pulpit rabbi, right? No one will ever be happy with you. There's always going to be people who like you, people who don't like you, people who want you out of your job. But to back your question, Mirko, I think that we have to come up with a way to tell something that will engage people. I don't know what that is necessarily. I don't have the answer, but I think it does involve opening up our ears and our minds to be able to grapple with an idea that is different than what we already believe, and that's something that I find we're closing ourselves off all the time now. That will make that extremely difficult to be able to achieve that.
So, Yaakov, thank you very much. Mirko, by the way, Mauricio, if you could put Mirko in touch with Gusti. Gusti's department has a game which for young people could be very useful. That's a game of, trying to put together a coalition with all the various parties. And, I tried it in my Kihila last election, and the parties change a little bit, but it's the issues are the same. So that might be useful for folks in Brazil. Just a thought for the young people that Mirko is addressing. So, and we're just about at 1 o'clock. So we've been privileged to spend this time with Yaakov Katz, who gave us a lot of insight, wonderful analysis, and humbled us by realizing we don't have too many solutions for the challenges that are forthcoming in the next election, but certainly bear careful attention because although the voting blocks seem frozen and fixed, surprises could still occur. And to the extent that we can encourage people to participate in the process, so thanks everyone. Thank you to Maurice.
Thank you
For setting this up, and thanks again.